And me, along with my colleagues, Alexandra Sirota and Mel Umbarger, and we have fantastic panelists with us, are going to talk to you today and talk with you today about how our tax choices impact not only our present, but our future. And we'll take a step back and we'll talk about also tax choices from the past, how they echo into our present. We'll talk about the impacts of those tax changes on our priorities for our communities and how these tax changes impact our shared future and what we can do to encourage lawmakers to make the right tax policy choices for our state. At BTC on building a better budget for North Carolina. And for us, that means demanding a more transparent budget process that connects the people that are closest to the priorities and the urgencies in their community to the policy process, giving them a voice in the policy process and demanding a more equitable tax code as part of that, and making clear how public investments lead to a more equitable anti-racist outcomes and a stronger state of North Carolina. So first, we're going to take a look back to tax policy choices from our past and how they reflect to our present. So first, I'll say that it's important to note that tax policy is not race neutral. North Carolinians of color end up paying more of their income taxes than white people due to some features of the tax code in our state. Many of these features and policies were intentionally created, and less explicitly, racist tax policies, both from generations back and in the past decade, work to preserve racial wealth divides. So as an example, this is a picture of a school in Pitt County in the 1860s. So in the period after the Civil War, when public schools were segregated, the General Assembly in our state passed a tax law that allowed white property owners to pay taxes that would fund only white schools, while Black property owners' taxes would pay for schools that would serve Black children. Well, of course, most people who owned land in the state were white. So this law had the impact that schools that served white children were much, much better funded. So in 1886 in New Bern, per pupil spending at the local public schools was $11 per white student, but only $5 per Black student. While this law ended some years later, it had a significant and ongoing impact on the investments in public schools and, of course, the quality of education at those schools. As another example, at the beginning of the 20th century, the then governor of our state changed the tax code, significantly increasing the tax code on Black citizens. And great efforts were also taken at that time to fund white schools at a much higher level than schools that served Black students. And more recently, we see this history echoed into our present tax code and the tax changes that have happened, that have been ushered in over the past decade. They've only served to reinforce racial divisions. So as an example, flattening and reducing the personal income tax rate has diverted wealth to affluent white taxpayers, while people of color have seen less of their proportional share of the tax reductions. So the reason for this is that there are generations of public policy and private practice that have created barriers to the kinds of jobs and wealth that it takes to get into the upper echelons of the income spectrum that have received most of the tax cuts over the past decade. And Alexandra is going to go into more detail about those specific tax changes in just a moment. And of course, educational segregation and underinvestment have kept many workers of color from getting the training they need to access the best paying jobs. To make matters worse, many people at the top of the economic heap, so to speak, don't get most of their income from working, but instead from investments based on wealth that they inherited or already have. So the result is a seemingly race-neutral policy, like cutting personal income taxes, actively works to preserve the economic status quo and reinforce racial wealth divides. So now I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes to my colleague, Alexandra Sirota, to talk about these recent tax choices and why they matter.
Thanks, Heba. It's great to be with you all to talk about this really critical issue, one that we often don't lift up, but as Heba shared, is so connected to the goals we have for our state, equality, racial equity, and so connected to the pathways to improve well-being, whether it be education or health. Economic prosperity is really dependent on the decisions we make in the area of tax policy. Who pays taxes, how taxes are distributed, what taxes pay for, all matter for whether we can achieve economic well-being, prosperity over the long term. And that is also, as we've shared already, really dependent on making sure that no matter who you are, where you live, you have access to opportunity. And that goal of anti-racist outcomes from our tax policy is really critical. But unfortunately, next slide, North Carolina since 2013 has been on a path to completely eliminate the state's income tax. Both the personal income tax, and if we go to the next slide, the corporate income tax, have been ratcheted down year after year through scheduled rate reductions. The corporate income tax is already scheduled to reach zero after 2029. And proposals on the table today in North Carolina's legislature would bring the personal income tax even closer to zero. This is an unacceptable path for North Carolina to be on. It puts at risk our ability to invest long-term, and because it is scheduled out over the next decade, is something that will constrain the ability of future lawmakers and future North Carolinians to make decisions about priorities that they need to see in their communities. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the tax changes on the table this session. We are in the conference process of the budget, which is when the legislative chambers, the Senate and the House, come together to reconcile the differences in their proposals and put forward a final budget. But we really have three choices on the table. The governor put forward the first proposal for a state budget, a 2-year state budget at the beginning of the process. And that included a very novel approach to tax changes. Basically, the governor would propose keeping the corporate income tax at the current 2.5% and lowering the personal income tax rate only for households with $200,000 or less following the scheduled rate reductions. That would mean that households with higher incomes would stay at the current 4.75%. This is an important policy that protects $1.7 billion in state public funds that could be used for a whole host of priorities in our communities. That said, the two proposals that are currently most likely to be part of the conversation in the conference process are the House and the Senate proposals for tax changes. In the middle of the slide, you see what the House proposed doing. The House proposed lowering the personal income tax rate slightly in 2024, and then continuing along the scheduled path through 2030. The Senate, and by far the most significant and dangerous shift among these proposals, would bring the personal income tax rate down to 2.49% after 2029. This is a significant rate reduction, again, along the path to zero, complete elimination of the personal income tax. And its impact in the final year that it goes into effect. So once we get as a state to that 2.49 rate, the state would have $7.6 billion less in public funds for ensuring healthy environments, healthcare access, public education, early childhood education, and so many priorities we hear about in our communities. Next slide. So I want to dig deeper into the problems with the Senate plan, because this really is the biggest threat that North Carolina faces in terms of the long-term future. The Senate tax plan would give the richest 1% a far greater tax cut than the poorest 20%. You can see this tax change projected as a share of income. The richest 1% have on average an income of over $1 million. The poorest 20% have incomes below $20,000. So a significant shift and diversion of our community wealth to the very wealthy. Next slide. The richest 20% receive more than 67% of the total tax cut from the personal income tax changes in the Senate budget. Again, going to reinforce the inequalities that we're already seeing in our economy and making it more difficult to provide for opportunity for more people in the state. Next slide. And as have been mentioned, this is not a race neutral decision. This decision would provide a greater share of the tax cut than is proportional to the share of tax filers to white households. That is a challenge, as we know that getting to economic prosperity, getting to greater well-being requires us to dismantle the barriers to opportunity, to proactively look to the ways that we can connect communities of color across our state to economic opportunity. Next slide. So in the next few weeks and indeed months, it's critical that we set the record straight, that tax policy should not allow the rich to get richer, that tax cuts on the table do not benefit people today or future generations in North Carolina, that eliminating the income tax entirely is the goal of this movement over time, and that we know that that goal does not work to help our economy and to help our communities because it's based on a flawed idea about trickle-down economics. Instead, we need a different economic strategy. Tax cuts are not pro-economy. Investing in people, investing in public schools, investing in the small businesses in our communities, making sure that people can access healthy water and infrastructure that connects them to opportunities. That's the pro-economy strategy North Carolina needs. So we know that tax cuts will mean future cuts to the public funds needed to meet people's priorities. And we know it's going to be our work to connect the dots to make sure that we get across these tax choices this session matter for our state now. They matter for our state in the future. And we're excited to be with you today to talk more about how we can work together to push hard against this proposal to continue to cut income taxes for the wealthy and profitable corporations. With that, I'll turn it back to my colleague, Heba. I'm really excited for the conversation, and a quick shout out to ITEP for helping us with the analysis. I'm really excited to talk with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And I'm so excited to introduce you all to our panelists. And we have with us today Briquisha Sams from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. And we also have with us Vicki Lee Parker High, the Executive Director of the NC Business Council. So first, Vicki, I'd like to hear from you. We often hear that tax cuts mean jobs and economic prosperity. And as Alexandra mentioned, we know that's false. Vicki, can you tell us about what businesses care about beyond tax cuts and how those billions of dollars we're losing to tax cuts that largely benefit the wealthy and big corporations could be used on the public services that are important to businesses?
Thank you. Thank you all for having me, and thank you for raising awareness of this really important issue. And again, when people, even businesses, hear tax cut, your instinct is to think this is a good thing. That's the threat of all of this, because people instinctively think, well, they're cutting taxes, we pay too much, this is ultimately good, and they don't pull the curtain open and look behind to see kind of what's going on behind that cut. But there are businesses, a lot of our members with the North Carolina Business Council do understand kind of what's going on behind that curtain and what it really means when you hear their talk about cutting taxes. And we understand that those dollars that are taken out of this pool have to be made up elsewhere. It really does increase and has a potential of leading to higher taxes and higher fees other places. But let me start first with how it directly impacts businesses, because you don't have those funds to provide some of the really critical services and benefits that businesses need to grow and thrive. Number one being a well-educated and highly skilled workforce. So a lot of the funds that we see are, being pulled out through the tax reduction, are going to hit on those areas that we need to support our school systems, that we need to support our community colleges, which help provide those specific skill sets for a lot of businesses. Those things are really critical. In addition, we also, employers, businesses need healthy workforce. So we want to make certain that we have funds that we can invest to make certain that we have a healthy healthcare system, public health system. A lot of people don't realize all of the things that go into having a local public health system and how that needs to be supported. So again, we learned a lot about it during the pandemic and just the critical roles. We think of hospitals and doctors, but the public health system, they play a lot. They do a lot to keep our workforce safe and healthy. And so we need to make certain that there are funds there to keep a continued healthy workforce. Childcare is huge.
Absolutely.
It's
crucial.
Another area that we're seeing that directly impacts businesses. They wanted to bring back their workforce after the pandemic, but because we had, an additional childcare shortage, and in addition to it already being expensive, that has created quite a dilemma for us. So we need to make certain that our state has the funds to look at some of these problems and provide solutions and investments to provide, healthy solution to these things that all kind of work back and help, and play back into keeping our businesses sustained and growing and resilient. And another one I'll touch on, even though there has been some investment in it, is we want to make certain that everybody, all of our businesses, have access to the internet and broadband. And, again, if you're moving tax dollars from that area, it creates these problems and makes or worsen them. So we need to make certain that all our businesses, a lot of them now are, in rural areas, and we have to make certain that they are able to communicate and share information with as much ease as those of us located here, in Raleigh, where we take for granted when we get on that our internet is going to work and we're going to make it through a Zoom call. I was just on one and someone had to fall off because her internet was really wasn't viable, and so it's a real issue. We have a lot of things that we need to work on to keep our businesses growing.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you for helping us see behind the curtain, so to speak, and understand what businesses need to be successful in our state. Briquisha, I'd like to turn it over to you now. We heard from Vicki why public investment is so important to local businesses in our state, from childcare to public education to health. Now, I'd like to hear from you about your research. why won't income tax cuts deliver the promised results? And there was a question in the chat specifically about states like Texas, and Rakisha happens to be from Texas. So we'd love to hear from you on that too.
Yeah, thanks for having me today.
Thank you for being here.
So income taxes are one of the few progressive tax structures that states levy, and it focuses on ability to pay, meaning that if your income goes down, your taxes go down. Whereas if you have something like a property tax, when your income goes down, your property tax bill doesn't go down, which relates to Texas. In Texas, one of our main research projects, which we call Who Pays, where it looks at the regressivity, or basically looking at how taxes impact low income and middle income Americans. We look at how Texas has one of the most unfair tax systems in the country. They're in the top 10. And so, and
Rakisha,
most of
would you mind mentioning for us what it means to have a progressive versus a regressive tax system, just in simple terms?
Oh, yes, sorry about that. So progressive means, or regressive means, that a higher share of the income from low income individuals goes towards taxes, as opposed to a lower share of income goes towards taxes for wealthier people. And so a progressive tax, you see a higher share of income goes towards taxes from wealthier people, whereas a lower share of income goes towards taxes from lower income people. So it's a more fair system. And so in Texas, you don't see that because property taxes are regressive and sales taxes are regressive. So like I was saying, Texas is in the top 10 states of the most regressive tax systems in the country. So not having an income tax actually doesn't work out for the state. And so that's why you see a state like North Carolina with an income tax working on where it has, I think, I guess a decade ago or so, where North Carolina had a graduated rate income tax, where there was different income taxes for each level of income, was a very progressive structure for the state. And so now that there's a flat rate, it's actually not that great for the state. And so thinking about how the state of North Carolina is starting to move where they're disguising these income tax cuts, and by disguising, I mean they're taking it slowly, where they're cutting every year or every few years, is different from, say, a state like Kansas, where you see they're cutting it all at once. And so as you saw in Kansas this year, they're cutting it all at once, and then it got vetoed by the governor, and the legislature actually didn't have enough votes to override the veto. So you see things like this. So you see these different political maneuvers going on, and it reveals how people just don't support tax cuts. And the polls show it. The polls show that people want corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share. And so you also see another example of this in Massachusetts, where they had a surplus revenue, but they also passed a millionaire's tax. And why did this happen? They initially focused on supporting transportation and other resources in their budget. So you see that and you think, okay, well, they have a revenue, so they support these things. And similar to what Vicky was talking about, how you use the revenue to invest in public services and things like that, why would they want to increase more revenue? But they saw that and thought it's about equity. So that's another avenue for North Carolinians to think about, is in talking about equity. And we talked a lot about that earlier when Hebel was talking about the history of North Carolina's tax system being inequitable on racial equity lines. And so you see that and you talk about that, and that's how Massachusetts won their ballot victory to have a millionaire's tax. And so you see that across the country, and it goes to show you that it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these battles are possible. And so you see states also like a state like Washington, where they have a very regressive tax system. It's also in the top 10, like a Texas, but you just also witnessed them.
And Washington has no income tax. Is that correct?
Yes, Washington has no income tax. And so you also see them just have support from the Supreme Court to pass a capital gains tax, which North Carolina has. So you see these examples of where there is some glimmer of hope for you to pass bills that support progressive tax policies, that help invest in policies that support families, like a EITC, CTC, or that also raise revenue to help you support in programs like education, clean air, water, libraries, fire departments, things like that. So it's possible to do this in North Carolina. It's just working and understanding these political maneuvers and getting out there and making your voice heard and making sure that you understand these policies and looking for other examples in other states and getting out there and again making your voice heard and thinking about what other states are doing, collecting that information and using their strategies to get to the finish line.
So Burkisha, states that have eliminated the income tax have really had to then, to make up for revenue loss, pass really regressive policies, i.e. tax policies that require that middle income and lower income people in the state pay more of a share of their income. And you also mentioned, though, that some states right now, there seems to be an appetite for more progressive tax policies around the country. People are starting to understand that their tax systems are asking more from low income and moderate income people in the state. And you also mentioned that in terms of public opinion, people do not support tax cuts. And that's also the case in North Carolina. So we have a blog on this. There was a recent poll that revealed that I believe it's 69% of North Carolinians oppose the recent tax cuts. Only 9% of people in the state strongly approve of them. So I think we see that what you mentioned reflected here. And just one note, I wanted to ask you a question, Burkisha. So you're a tax expert, but some of us aren't. Would you just mention what is a capital gains tax and what is the EITC?
So the EITC is the Earned Income Tax Credit. And to basically describe it, it is a refundable tax credit. So that means if you file your taxes and you have zero tax liability, meaning if you don't owe any taxes and you have a negative balance, you get a refund of that amount. And the earned income means you get a tax credit on your earned income. So it basically is like a match almost on how much income you earn throughout the year. I don't actually know the exact numbers, and it depends on the state with how much they match the actual federal earned income. So I don't know the exact mechanics of how it works in North Carolina, but I know that's how it typically works in most states. They match
we don't have
federal.
we don't have an EITC.
Okay.
We're, I think, the only, or maybe one of two states that have the distinction of allowing our EITC to expire. So we had it for a very short time and we no longer have it, which is very unfortunate, or a refundable child tax credit. So we have a few questions in the chat. And so Vicky or Burkisha, if you would like to take them. The first asks, why these tax cuts benefit, the past decade of tax cuts benefit the wealthy and big corporations, as do the tax cuts in the Senate tax plan. So why are elected officials okay with this? This seems egregious. We agree with you. And we're in a moment, we're going to talk about what we can do to raise our opposition. And Latasha has a fantastic question. Has anyone considered challenging the fact that there's no inheritance tax in North Carolina, given the increased disparity in wealth distribution? I think, Alexandra, that question might be for you.
Oh, I'll jump in. I'll say, I think there have been efforts to talk about the importance of wealth taxes broadly, both an inheritance tax, an estate tax. There are a number of ways in which we can get at addressing the disparity in wealth, as you mentioned. Part of that is through the tax code, and then part of that is through our public funds going to investments that build wealth over time. Again, connecting people to affordable home ownership opportunities, some of the traditional wealth building tools that we have in this country that have too often been excluded. So I think we are constantly considering this option. We want to be putting these things on the table and would love to work with you on that. I think one of the things, if I could just say something about the other question that you raised, Heba, why are elected officials not looking out for all their constituents? I think this is part of the issue we have in North Carolina, and part of the reason we're excited to be in conversation with you all. We really need to explain that these tax cuts are not for the vast majority of North Carolinians, and that protecting the very rich and wealthy through reducing their income taxes is actually going to hurt not just everyone, but them as well, because we will have fewer investments in community. So I think a lot of the work is breaking through and making clear that the tax policies are not delivering for everyone. And I think the reason that there's a strong commitment on the leadership side to income tax reductions is this idea that giving dollars to very high income people will trickle down to grow the economy, when we know that the economic record shows investing in bottom-up strategies and foundation strategies that connect more people to opportunity is what's going to grow opportunity and economic well-being.
Thanks, Alexandra. And Vicki, I think this is a question for you.
Yeah.
Heather asks, is the business community in NC pushing back on the reductions in corporate income taxes, or are they going along with it? Their voice to senators would make a big difference if they oppose the tax cuts.
Well, certainly I do agree that our voice is very important, but I also want to add that all of our voices are very important. I think back to the initial question, what about why elected officials are doing this? A big part of it is because of the redistricting issue. And they feel, and not feeling that they have to answer to a broad constituency because they're elected by a few. So the big answer to that is that we do have to vote. We all have to participate and have our voices heard. Now, on the short term, in terms of pushing back and really having those conversations, those one-on-one conversations, there are businesses who get this, and the North Carolina Business Council works to connect those business voices to our leaders. But again, if they don't feel that all of the people and all those who can vote are going to come out and really show in mass force that they're going to be held accountable for their actions, they tend not to listen. So we want to make certain, I think in our last election in 2020, it was about just barely 70% of our voters participated. That was higher than 2016, but however, that's 30% of people that we still need to bring to the table to educate. So it's on both sides. We need to show people the urgency and that their vote really can still make a difference, and also educate our representatives on what these policies actually do. So there are a number of issues at hand. A lot of them don't understand the impact of these policies. They don't understand. They really do believe that, it's not going to trickle down, that the wealth is being hoarded at the top. They're investing it, they're holding on to it. It's not moving to these other programs and other, issues, other areas as they tend to proclaim.
And
Thank you. So, I apologize, Vicki. Did I interrupt you?
Oh no, I was just gonna add something, that a strategy that I think that also can work, that is, I think, underutilized, is repetition. I think going to the Capitol and just explaining that investing in public education matters and we need tax dollars to do that, explaining that investing in public services helps families, and explaining that tax cuts are bad for the economy. Just repeating that explanation is really important to legislators, and repeating that in the media, and writing op-eds, LTEs, and just repeating that, because I think that's how the like wealthy and the corporations have gotten their message out. Is just they have a lot of money already, but they've also been repeating this message for a long time now, especially trickle down, which has been around since the 80s. It's been around for a long time. So we had, some folks have an uphill battle to climb already, but I think just repeating that message to a lot of lawmakers, convincing them, because again, if you look at Kansas, they had a Democrat for governor and a Republican legislature, which sounds eerily similar to North Carolina. So, and they only had I think one Republican vote on the side of Democrats to get to where the veto wasn't overturned. So it sounds eerily similar to North Carolina. So it is possible.
Thank you, Rakisha. And I just wanted to mention that, in fact, businesses are piping up and saying, tax competitiveness is important to us, but we actually did not ask for an elimination, and they're doing so publicly. There was recently an article, and they're noting that all of the things that Vicki mentioned, childcare, public education, are extremely important to marketability and competitiveness and attracting a talented, great workforce that wants to stay in our state. There is a question. Absolutely, Lynn. I was Googling furiously, trying to find it. I will share that article. Mel, maybe you can help me. Mel's better with the Google than I am. So Sebastian asks about how states can address wedges between market values and assessed values of homes and lack of oversight of local government and municipalities' autonomy to set zoning ordinances. Does anybody have anything to say about that?
I can say something very high level. I think it probably requires a deeper dive into some of the conversations and intersections between local and state authority, as well as into the housing market. But I think in the context of a conversation about taxes, this is a really critical issue. We're seeing it across the state where property tax values are going up. The process of valuation is happening more frequently after a period of hold during the pandemic. And many households are struggling now with new assessed values. Unless our state legislature really begins to think seriously about the ways in which the state can address the inequities that Rakisha talked about in the property tax system, both in terms of the valuation, as you point to, and the way that taxes are levied, we won't be able to get to this equitable tax code that we need. And so one of the ideas that we've worked on, and there's been legislation introduced, is trying to improve the state's property tax relief programs that are targeted to low-income people. This is the best way to address rising property taxes and make sure that local governments still have the revenue they need, which is increasingly required of them as the state pulls back its dollars to fund the programs in community. So really hope to dig in more on these housing questions at a future conversation, but hopefully that gives you a high level thought about it. There are tools available.
And Sebastian, to your question, I just wrote a paper on property tax circuit breakers, which basically look at ways to make sure homeowners aren't overloaded with their property taxes. I'll put that in the chat, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me.
Thanks, Rakisha. We have another question, and don't worry. So Mary asks, is there somewhere like the General Assembly website where one can see which specific legislators are working on specific budget items, or does it work that way? This is a fantastic question, Mary, because we talk about how important budget process transparency is, and this is why. So we've seen over the last several years that there are less and less opportunities for the public to see exactly what is going on behind the scenes when budget decisions are being made. And there's less and less time for the lawmakers who are not in key positions of power in certain committees to even have the time they need to read the, for example, 1,000 pages related to the budget before amendment deadlines and before being forced to vote. So right now we're in what's called the conference process, and we can't really see what's going on. It's behind the scenes. So we can read the budget that the House passed, we can read the budget that the Senate passed, we can read the governor's budget proposal, but we can't see what exactly is going on right now. But really the committee process in general is the way to do that. So for example, the standing committees related to appropriations and base budget in both chambers would be the way to even have an understanding of what might be proposed, and especially the tax plans. But right now we can't really see it. Of course, we can look at voting records of lawmakers. We can see the bills that they've introduced to give us a sense. Do you have anything to add, Alexandra?
No, I think that was good. I mean, we're happy to send around some links to the appropriations committees and where to find those on the NC Ledge website. But the other thing I would just say is the people named to the conference committee has been published, and that is something that you can use to communicate about your priorities, even if, again, it's not a specific legislator working on a specific budget item. And I just would emphasize Heba's point that the process has become very centralized. And so the key voices are really in the leadership positions, both the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, and the appropriations and finance chairs of both chambers.
Thanks, Alexandra. And I'm now, lots of folks are asking, well, what do we do about this? So we want to engage all the lawmakers who are on both the House and the Senate conference committees, and we want to urge them to reject additional tax cuts. So we'll make sure that a link to our action, I just shared it in the chat, and also a link where you can find that list of the lawmakers that are on those committees. And we also want your help. We want to learn from you, and we're going to share our email addresses and how you can contact us at the end of the webinar. We want to learn from you what taxes fund in your community and how important those public services are to your community. And of course, spread the word. So share this webinar, share the links that we just shared in the chat, let folks know about the harm of tax cuts. And finally, a lot of the information that we shared with you today is part of our Go at Your Own Pace Policy Academy, kind of Tax and Budget 101, and we shared the link there. So before we move on, I want to thank my colleagues, and I want to thank our panelists, Rakisha and Vicki. Thank you so much for everything you do to keep businesses in our community healthy and to educate us on the impact of tax choices across the country. So please stay in touch with us. And on this slide, you'll see how you can get a hold of us, how you can access our website, follow us on social media, and you can contact us to share all of the ways that questions, comments, and all of the ways that taxes support the public services and programs that are so crucial to your community. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you all for joining us. We will share all of the information in a follow-up email, so stay tuned.